This is a talk that I gave as part of the ComPSAC, Computers, Software, and Applications Conference at Tunghai University in Taichung, Taiwan. This talk argues that the nature of work is changing, in no little way because of the role of IT software. Hence, it's important to think to the future when we organize our teams for creating IT technology, and it's also important to think about the impact of that technology upon the greater workforce. We start by noticing a couple of things. First, work is socially constructed. It's a way that we organize ourselves to produce goods and services. And that social construction depends upon our society's goals, upon what we're trying to do, upon our wealth, upon the tools that we have available. In many ways, it appears that we are seeing the biggest change in the nature of work since roughly 1915, which corresponds to the time when the modern industrial engineers put in place and completed the process of mass production. Those industrial engineers include people like Henry Ford and Frederick Winslow Taylor. What we are seeing are forces, largely forces coming from information technology, that alter the workforce at large and also change the IT workforce. Now, when we talk about technology and the workforce, one of the first questions that comes to mind is what happens to our job? What will happen when we have robotic workers? Our reactions tend to swing between two extremes. First, we get frightened that robots will take away our work and destroy all the jobs, leaving us nothing to do, impoverished and broke. Second, we hear people claim that robots and automated workforces actually create new jobs so that there will be more work than there was before. If we look at these positions, we discover quickly that there's no definitive information that says either case is actually true. One of the reasons for this is that we think of computing and computing technology in terms of replacing human workers or augmenting specific workers. We would say that we have a hierarchy, like the one here, and that we will identify one worker, and then we would replace that worker with a computer, or potentially augment that person with a computer. At the end, we expect that the hierarchy remains pretty much the same, except it has a computer in it. In fact, computers and computing technology tends to restructure an organization, and sometimes restructure an organization rather radically. Hence, it's difficult to say which jobs were created by the computer and which were destroyed. To get a picture of how technology transforms work, let's look back at this advertisement from a laptop manufacturer from 1992. You may remember it. It showed someone, usually a woman, usually a barefoot woman, working on a laptop in a pleasant vacation area. And it asked the question, who needs a window office? It implied, and I should add we all really believed this, that laptop and portable computers would make our lives more pleasant and allow us to work in more favorable environments. What it didn't say was that these computers would allow our work to follow us on vacation. Perhaps one of the reasons it didn't is that this was the pre-internet age, really the pre-wireless and cell phone age as well. And we did not anticipate that having a computer with us would mean that we were linked through communications network to our home office. If we were to redo this ad in 2015, not only would we take our work on vacation, we would have no office at all. You see many people now working in coffee shops and in other more formal places called co-work spaces, where you spend a small amount of money, you get a free cup of coffee, a locker, and Wi-Fi. And that allows you to work without a permanent office or place and without a permanent position. I should add the logos in the bottom of the slide indicate a couple of firms, particularly Topcoder, that employ IT workers on part-time basis and have a lot of workers not only willing to do this work, but eager because it gives them a little more control over their own lives. So the question we have to ask is, what is happening to work? This is a slide that will be in every talk in every part of my career. It's of the Mathematical Tables Project, which was a 1938 computing office. It was, by all we can tell, the largest computing office, 450 people, that existed prior to the invention of the electronic computer. What has happened to work like this, and in fact all work, with the addition of technology is that it fragments it. It breaks it up into smaller and smaller parts. It tends to separate labor, the actual work, from the leadership of that work, though this is a trend in labor that has existed for a long time. It promotes new social structures, notably market-based social structures. And it alters three fundamental elements of a working structure: the position that workers have, that is to say, how the workers are related to each other, who reviews who. It also changes the status of workers, how much individual workers can influence the other workers who surround them. Finally, it alters perhaps the most fundamental aspect of work, the function, what skills people have, and what things they actually do. Finally, technology seems to be weakening conventional corporate structure, or at least providing a force to reorganize those structures. The basic idea we have for why we have corporations at all is a thing known as the Coase thesis, named after the economist Ronald Coase. Coase developed this idea in 1938, although he only recently passed away. He argued that we have corporations to minimize certain kinds of costs. Otherwise, we'd simply go to the market to do everything. We wouldn't have corporations. If we wanted to build a car, we'd go to the market to get labor and material and services and all the things that we would need in order to build a car. That, in theory, would be the lowest cost way of producing any good or service. However, there are costs in going to the markets. You have to learn what the market can offer. You have to describe what you want. You have to take the pieces and put them together. You run the risk of having a market fail on you or getting a bad good. All of these costs can be reduced by having a corporate hierarchy, a vertical hierarchy of managers with inside workers who create goods and managers who try to bring the costs of these goods as low as possible. In many circumstances, Coase argued, the cost of the corporate structure is less than the savings you would get by doing everything at a market. Now, in recent years, because of electronic technology and the ability to create markets and do market transactions in new ways, we've seen a more dynamic market form of employment. Some people are calling this the sharing economy, and it includes such things as Uber and Lyft and other things that use market structures in place of hierarchies. This symbol, the sharing economy, came from a conference held at the Federal Trade Commission in Washington, D.C. in early June 2015. In it, they discussed the potential size of this economy and where this economy was going and the kind of regulation that it might need. In addition to Uber and Lyft and other transportation services, we are seeing general office services, accounting, personal assistance, and other things being available on a per-case basis by demand using a market. We're also seeing more sophisticated services, such as data analysis. An Australian firm named Kaggle will take your data, put a description of it and what you want to its market, and let data analysts come and tell you what is in that data. We're also seeing legal and some accounting services being available through part-time workers working on the network to work with individual clients on projects. And as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing IT services, primarily coding services, but some design services as well, being available on a per-project basis over the web through a market. I recently had a colleague who needed a mobile app, and she asked me if I might be able to provide a student who could code it for her. I said, you'll get a better app, and you'll get someone better able to support you in the long term if you go to one of these markets. She was a little concerned because she's not a tech person, but she very quickly was able to get a mobile cloud app for her publishing business, and that app has served her very well. She was able to do this without getting a full-time employee for her business. The Washington Conference tried to estimate the size of the sharing economy, and they came up with the figure of $29 billion, although their methods don't seem to be at all accurate. Yet it does indicate that there is a large scale of work now being done by part-time workers on a project-by-project basis and supporting themselves. This new kind of work is an example of what I'm calling the Malone Thesis. It's due to Tom Malone, who's a professor at MIT. Back in 1987, he argued that the networked world, the internet and the other networks that have come along with it, would not merely produce a faster and more connected world. It would fundamentally change the nature of hierarchical corporate structure. The article is called Electronic Markets and Hierarchies, and it was published in 1987 in the Communications of the ACM. He said that computing technology and communications technology would make the world more market-driven because, first, it reduces the cost of record keeping, which is an important thing. Second, it would reduce risk, which is affiliated with record keeping. If you think what something like Uber does, Uber allows people to be part-time ad hoc cab drivers, but it keeps the records for those cab rides cheaply and allows people to look at the billing, to know who their driver is, to know who took them, and hence reduce the risk of this kind of market. It also reduces the costs of communication. And that's important because it allows you to build a big market that might not survive in a small geographic area. And finally, information technology has new tools that allow us to build markets where it was difficult to build them before. If your good is expensive or hard to describe or available only to a small number of people for a short period of time, you have to have something that brings your buyers and sellers together and has rules for how they work together. The tools that help with that are called algorithmic game theory, and they've recently become central to a certain part of computer science. Now, a second aspect is we're not just expanding markets, we're really expanding the urban experience, the experience of people working and living closely together on defined tasks that produce goods and services. The urban experience makes the factory experience possible. It builds a common market that's easy to reach because people live closely. It has mass labor, consolidated supply, and some kind of socialized activity amongst the residents of urban life. Now, one of the socialized activities is a sense of privacy that does not exist in agricultural or farm life. On a farm or in a small community, everyone knows everyone else's business, and at some level, you need that to support the activity. People need to know when their neighbor is having trouble so that they can be there and support them, so that their neighbor will not find themselves unable to continue their work. In urban life, you need to have barriers. You can't do your work if you are learning everything that goes on around you, what all your neighbors are doing, and being concerned about it. This idea of privacy comes from Lewis Mumford's book, The City in History. And it's clear that privacy, security, and the fact of people working together who have little prior contact, the idea of urbanization, is part of what is happening on the network. Now, this means that with networking and computer technologies, we are reinventing urban institutions. And here I'm meaning urban as networked or computer-based rather than geographic-based, in new ways that are more sophisticated than those that exist in geographically based cities. First, we're rethinking privacy. We know it grew out of urban life, and we also know that modern work is impossible without it. It is even more impossible with networked work. Next, we're building supporting institutions. Urban life needs institutions to replace the family, to help people survive, do their work, and operate when they don't have an extended family to support them. Insurance is perhaps the best example of an institution that supports a city life, that replaces family when family is not close. Next, we need what are called regionalizing institutions. These are advocates. They build the local economy, especially an economy that's no longer geographically based. They tell people this is where you get your goods and services, bring assets, bring workers to the activities, and then supports that work as it progresses. Finally, we need one more class of institutions, which I'll discuss in a moment, called urbanizing institutions. These are institutions that help workers, help the citizens of the network in our case, be better workers in their new environment. Let's take a look at supporting institutions for the moment. These are things that replace families and do the support work that families would. But they have to do it in a very new environment that is quite different from the small-town, family-based agricultural environment. A good example, as I said, were insurance and annuity firms. In the United States, for example, a big one started as the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association of America. It was designed to help teachers have a financial basis and to be able to settle in a community far from their family and have money that would support them in times of trouble and when they grew too old to teach and didn't have a family to support them. These institutions took other forms. We had things called familial and burial societies that took care of individuals' funerals and other things in times of trouble. Traditionally, as urban life grew, these kinds of institutions were supported by employers, particularly after the growth of the labor movement in the United States in roughly 1936, 1937. But increasingly, we're seeing these things going back to independent organizations. And at some level, that's something we're really going to need to consider, because if people don't have the kind of permanent connection to a company, they will need some other way to ensure a permanent connection to the insurance companies, the annuities, and the other institutions that support them. Two of the market-based firms, Uber and Crowdflower, both operating out of Silicon Valley, have recently been told that they need to start considering what services they provide their workers, the people who come to their markets. It's still a ways before we get an answer for what they will do or what will be the right kind of structure, but we're starting to work on this part of the new kind of work already. The socializing institutions were institutions that took new residents of the city, almost exclusively young men, although there are a few for young women, and teach them how to behave in a city, how to deal with others, how to deal with their employers, how to think about and to manage the demands that come when you start a family. In the American experience, there have been two big urbanization pushes. One's called the Great Brain Drain, which occurred roughly between 1920 and 1940. It took young men from small towns and farms in the middle and western part of the country and moved them into factories and offices in the newly building cities. The second is called the Great Migration. It began roughly 1930 and continued into the 60s. It brought African Americans from farms in the South to the cities in the North, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Memphis. In both cases, there were institutions formed to support these men and turn them from farm dwellers to city dwellers. In the Great Brain Drain, it was the YMCA. It was an organization that ran classes, had social opportunities, dances, and whatnot, and other things for young men. Particularly, it had sports to focus their attention when they weren't working. One of the things that we forget is that basketball was invented by a YMCA director to have an indoor sport in the winter for young men to do. The second one was the American Methodist Episcopal Church. This organization started working during the Great Migration, and it did many of the same things for the African Americans who are coming to the northern cities. Right now, we don't really have such institutions in cyberspace. Certainly, it's quite difficult to claim that something like Facebook is one of these institutions, although to some extent, Facebook could support such institutions. So when we're looking at market-based management, what do we mean? It's a dynamic activity that hires individual workers or teams for individual projects or activities. This market changes the basic elements that define workers. Position. Their relationship to a company becomes temporary. We are dealing with aggregated work and aggregated labor. In theory, this means that there will always be enough labor for all the workers, but in practice, it means that a worker may be working for many, many organizations, even over the course of a day or a week. Next, it modifies the function, because it abstracts things and tries to get them in a way so that work, instructions, and other things are carried over the internet and can be manipulated by computer programs. Finally, it changes the status, the way in which individual workers can influence and train and learn from each other. Now, these markets, needless to say, substantially restructure the hierarchy. Primarily, they emphasize status at the expense of position and function. Currently, the status, the recognition of a worker's influence, is recognized or tied to the position you have in the company. The people with a corner office, the people with a higher job. Now it's more connected to what you do. It's a form of credential. In effect, it's your history and the ability that you have demonstrated to show what you can do and to show others what you can do and why they should follow your lead. Now, these markets do what we have called the hollowing of the middle. This is our best understanding of what is happening to the workforce. As I've said, it's not automatically clear, certainly not ahead of the fact, that these new kinds of markets create or destroy jobs. It is, however, very clear that they do restructure them. and restructure them in ways that we are starting to understand. That is called the hollowing of the middle. And what we have here is a workforce, a group of workers who do a common sort of job. And we've got some who are high-skilled near the top of the picture, some who are low-skilled near the bottom, and some in the middle who have mid-skilled jobs. We know that technology tends to create new high-skilled jobs. Not only jobs that require high technical skills, but also jobs that require managerial and personal skills. We also know that it creates new low-skilled jobs, often lots of low-skilled jobs, because it allows a company to connect them into their operations better, allow them to do new kinds of things, engage in a broader scale and scope. What also seems to be the case is that we lose middle-skilled jobs, jobs that require some technical skills, some person skills. These things are usually focused and narrower than the high-skilled jobs. These kinds of jobs tend to decrease under new technology and have been decreasing for a long time. Furthermore, there tend to be strong barriers between these three groups. It's difficult to leap from low skill to mid skill and from mid skill to high skill. At some level, this has always been true. But more to the point, there are fewer mid-skill jobs, which make it harder for people with low skills to pull themselves up into the middle and eventually try to move themselves up to the top. There have been a number of labor economists working on this problem. The most prominent are Murnane and Levy and David O'Toole. If you want a simple example to understand how this works, let's look at waiters in restaurants, because they give us a typical story of how this process works. At one point, waiters were a uniform skilled job. You could come in off the street with very little experience and slowly rise through the ranks. You'd start with one table in the back of the restaurant and slowly move to more and more tables with greater responsibility at the front. It was easy to advance if you could demonstrate your skills. Once we started changing this with technology, the jobs themselves were altered. The technology was what's called an order system. And those are systems that allowed waiters to identify what a table wanted and get it to the kitchen without them necessarily going back. Now, we've been using non-computerized technology for order systems starting in the 50s and 60s. Lights and electricity and phones helped support these systems. But after about 87, we started doing it with computers, and with that, restauranteering changed and the job of waiter changed. In this new world, we have waiters, and they have become more senior. They have to handle more tables. They take orders, and they almost never go back to the kitchen. They are managing the restaurant experience, and they have to be good at handling difficult clients who are angry or upset or drunk. They also have to know how the technology works, know how to deal with exceptions, know how to get the things out of it that make the restaurant work. Below them, we have a group of food runners. Food runners take the food from the kitchen and place it on the table. They're mid-skill. They are intended to know how to get food and how to place it. But if you ask one of them for help, they'll say, "Let me get your waiter." They're meant to do a lot of work in a short span of time. There are not a lot of them, but they have replaced a certain number of the waiters because they are cheaper. After food runners, we have the low end, busboys. Often in the United States, busboys don't even speak English and have difficulty communicating with the rest of the staff. They clean up, and that's all they do. In IT, this phenomena was identified by Eric Raymond in his book, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. This book is largely about open source software, the technique of having volunteers build large software systems. But it shows how these new forms of work are spilling into every form of activity. And indeed, Raymond's book has had influence far beyond computer science and IT. It reminds us not only that work is socially constructed, that we can put people together in new ways, but it also reminds us that the jobs we're creating now, the jobs of 2015, are not the jobs of 1915. There's more market, more dynamic nature into it, an ability to work on your own and engage people through the mediation of a computer. So what do we do and how do we think about IT? Well, we're dealing with two kinds of problems: building systems and running organizations. And we recognize that IT, as a discipline, very quickly identified itself with organizational work. This is one of the very early books on IT management systems. It dates to 1962. It's due to Grad and Glanz, who were IBM employees. It argued that IT systems were the skeleton of a company, probably should have used the word nerve system because it held the company together and it transmitted ideas that leaders would need for decision making. And in particular, once we get more market-based decisions, the kind of information you need for market decisions are very different from those you need for internal managerial decisions. You need a much broader sense of the market. You need to project ahead. You need to match a more complicated supply to a more complicated demand. In effect, we need information systems that also break out of the hierarchical structure and bring more information from outside. So what do we anticipate? Well, as I've been saying all along, we're looking at a world in which jobs are created more and more by market-based decisions. You're not going to have a permanent job. You're not going to have a structure that holds people together for a long term. People are going to come and go quickly as they can apply their skills in other places that allow them to earn more money. We're needing a much broader set of data and stronger data analytics. And my comment about needing to look outside the corporation is a recognition that big data is the centerpiece of our new information systems, because the information you need is bigger, more dynamic, and more complex. Privacy and its close friend, security, are going to be more important to the corporation, because not only do we need to keep what individuals are doing private, we need to have mechanisms for sharing that privacy in a right way. It's not enough to build barriers. We have to build barriers that we know how to break, how to distribute information freely, and how to hold it back. If you think of the sense of privacy that Snapchat and Instagram have, they allow you to share information without worrying that the information is going to be permanently available and be used later. Next, we're looking at new kinds of institutions, particularly the supporting institutions and the urbanizing institutions. The supporting institutions provide a little more financial security to our workers, and the urbanizing train them and teach them how to behave. We're looking, obviously, at more decentralized operations, and we're finally recognizing that reputation is important. And we need to know how we can describe our reputations. Describe them in a way that can move from job to job, from field to field. We need to know how to protect them, how to defend them, and how to verify that the reputation is the one that goes with the worker. All of these things have many open questions. Let me end at this point by saying that I have a podcast that comes out every quarter with about 8 episodes a quarter on these very topics. It's called How We Manage Stuff. I'm doing it with Tamara Carlton, who is of the Innovation Leadership Board in Silicon Valley. This podcast, How We Manage Stuff, is available on iTunes at http://itunes.managestuff.net. We also have an Android version at pocketcast.management.net. And for those of you that don't use your mobile technology for podcasts, we have managestuff.net. All of these podcasts, as well as this talk, point to the fact that work is changing, and it's being changed because of IT services, and furthermore, IT services, particularly the production and deployment of these services, has to respond to these new forms of work. This is David Allen Greer. Take care.